Projects they are responsible for, but they have to do them.
So my family was not allowed to come back to Georgia until the late 1980s. And when my uncle first came back to Georgia, it was, I believe, 1988. And I had always dreamed about going to Georgia from as long as I can remember. So when the opportunity came up to go in 1989 with the Agivi and my cousin Nina, I jumped on it. I was so excited, and we spent a month here living with a family and getting to know all of my relatives. It was extraordinarily emotional for me. I was 25. I had just about to turn 25, actually. And I knew that there were these relatives in this country, but I had no idea who they were, what their names were, how old they were. And I remember building this family tree. And so everyone I met, I created this family tree, and who had which children and how old were they and who was related to whom. I remember the first day we got off the plane, and those were the days when people could actually meet you at the bottom of the plane. And I still have this picture from that first visit with everybody with their roses, and I think 40 or 50 family members that were there at the bottom of the plane to greet me that I didn't even know existed. I had no idea when I got here how many relatives there would be and who they would be, and it was, I think, probably the greatest, most joyful experience to finally meet this other half of my family that I had not known before. This visit for me, for the opening of the American Academy in Tbilisi's new campus, is I think it's the 22nd visit I've made to Georgia. So I've seen a lot of change in, 22 visits in that time period. Certainly the infrastructure is improved. When I was here in 1994, I remember when there was no electricity and wild dogs on the street, and I think you could buy Pepsi for 20 cents, and it was, it was a totally different experience than it is today, where I'm staying in the beautiful Marriott that's the nicest hotel for me in the world. I feel very comfortable walking everywhere. I don't have any concerns about safety. But what's remained the same is this wonderful, joyful feeling that I have when I'm here, and the warmth of all the people, and it's something, there's a word that I'm thinking of that I can't come up with right now, but it's so unusual. Something about the Georgian character is unlike anything anywhere else in the world. It's very special, it's very captivating, and I've always known that it was there, and it must have been instilled from my grandmother and my father and my uncle, but now I have so many other connections, and I understand this very special characteristic that I couldn't have imagined when I was younger. I have always felt Georgian. From the time I was a little girl, I was very close with my father and my uncle and my babo. My grandmother played an enormous role in my life. I even remember being a little girl and knitting some needlepoint for her, and it says babo on it. And we spent a lot of time together, and all the words, the adoring words she used for me, are still very much in my head. And I, from a very early age, was always called Lizzie Co. And so now in the United States, nobody really calls me Lizzie Co. But when I'm here and some people call me Lizzie Co, it just makes me feel so warm and like, I'm home. So, I've always felt Georgian. Probably I felt more Georgian than American, although I don't speak Georgian. I always wanted to learn Georgian. I tried for many, many years to learn Georgian. I even made a special effort when I was in high school. And I would drive from my high school to my grandmother's place So I used to drive 45 minutes or an hour once a week to go visit her to practice my Georgian. And so I know a little bit, Zali and Sota, but not enough. I certainly wish I knew more. But my love for Georgia is so deep, and I've done so many things that many people wouldn't understand unless they realized, this sort of strong calling I feel to try to be helpful and make a difference here. My grandfather was one of the leaders of the insurrection in 1924, which was unsuccessful. And as a result, the family had to escape. And they escaped to France under extremely difficult circumstances. And my grandfather and my grandmother were in Paris with the Georgian government in exile and the Georgian community. My father, my uncle, my grandfather, my grandmother, they were in extremely difficult conditions. They were living below poverty level. They didn't have enough money for food. My grandfather worked as a taxi driver. He made yogurt. They had really nothing. When they had to escape, they left everything. And so it was a very painful upbringing and period during the war. I think they saw a lot of awful things that my father just never wanted to remember. So he never talked about his experiences. And I wish that we had been able to write down more of what had happened to him, because there are some really extraordinary stories that have been lost, I think. So I hope, as part of my work, that we can try and piece together some of these pieces of history that are so important to the Georgian culture and identity, especially of the diaspora. In 1941, my grandfather was very involved in trying to help in any way that he could the Georgians wherever they were, and to try and help restore Georgian independence. And he went up to Romania, where there were 500 Georgians in a POW camp, and he attempted to get them released. He was able to get 100 of them released, but they refused to release the rest of them. And my grandfather said, "I will not leave any Georgians behind." And so he stayed in this prison camp, and he died of meningitis on his 50th birthday, which is today. So my grandfather had a short life that was dedicated to Georgia, and he lived for Georgia, and he died for Georgia. So for me to be having this interview today is very symbolic and emotional for me. My father went to the Sorbonne and l'École nationale de Ponts et Chaussées, and then he was identified by the French government as a very talented individual, and they tried to help protect him and hide him from the Germans because he had this unique knowledge of bridges and roads. So they actually tried to help him escape into Switzerland, and in the process of my father trying to escape, he was captured by the Germans, and he was taken to a POW camp, a prison camp, and he was in Germany for 9 months. But it's a wonderful story because the Georgians that were in Germany found out that my father had been captured, and they managed to forge some documents that said that my father, Othar Zaldastaninvili, was a very important person, and he should be released because he was very valuable to the Germans, and so he should be released into these Georgians' custody. How they managed to do that is beyond me, but Georgians, as you know, are so resourceful that they did, and they released my father to these Georgians, and they hid him in Berlin until he was able to escape, and he escaped in a Red Cross van that was driven by Princess Mia Dadiani, and she took him back to Paris. And it was an extraordinary situation. So after the war, my father thought he should continue his education, so he applied to Harvard to get his PhD. And he went to Harvard and was extremely successful, and my uncle Givi followed to get his MBA at Harvard, and my grandmother came with them as well. My Father's godfather was Kakutsa শ্বলি, and he played a very important role in my father and my family's life. He was my grandfather's dearest friend, and my grandfather dedicated his memoirs to Kakutsa. And these memoirs, some people may have seen, but he documents the uprising from 1924, and these are unique memoirs because they're not critical of people in particular. They just try to document the facts of what happened and why the uprising why it failed. So for people that haven't seen this document, I think it's really interesting because that, knowing this information will help prevent maybe something similar from happening in the future. So my uncle, Givi, from the time he was able to start coming back to Georgia, was involved in education because he really felt that education was the foundation of democracy. And he undertook a number of initiatives to try and help the education system. For example, he would teach business school classes here in Georgia. He brought Georgians, high potential Georgians, to the Harvard Business School. And ultimately, he decided that a model school that brought the best of American teaching methodology to Georgia would be the way that he could have the most impact. So he had this vision and this dream, and it started back in 1992. And he was formulating this idea. He worked with the president of Boston University, Silber, and developed a plan working with a man, Donald Thomas, who at that time had been one of the founders of BU, Boston University Academy. And so my Uncle Givi and Don collaborated for several years trying to formulate what this school would look like and how they could make it happen. And I played an interesting role in this process because in the process of trying to formulate, they had a good vision. They just didn't have the funding solidified to actually make the school, establish the school. So as my role as the head of the Georgian American diaspora at that time, I was able to convince the US government to give grants to the Georgian Association, which we administered, which were then able to train the teachers at Harvard School of Education and at Simmons. And so that was the beginning of the school. So the Georgian Association was founded in 1932 by prominent Georgians that had emigrated to the United States, one of whom was Siko Sidaman Aristov, the Orbeliani, Machabelli, and others. So it was established originally to help preserve the Georgian culture, help Georgians resettle in the United States, and further their education. But it was, I would say, social service kind of an agency. And it was very personal, and there weren't very many Georgians, so it really was to try and preserve the culture and traditions. In the 1950s, after my father graduated from Harvard and got his PhD, he was working, he was the president. So he was the president from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. And Zia Givi was the president in the 1970s. And then there were a variety of other presidents, and then I became the president in 1995. The Georgian Association was originally founded under very different conditions because Georgia was not independent. It was, under the communist rule, and there was no access to Georgia. All the Georgians in the United States were completely cut off, and so very isolated. And so really, this association was extremely important to the Georgians that were there because it was such a small community. And so they did some wonderful events to commemorate Independence Day. So always on May 26th there would be an event. Always on the anniversary of the uprising, 1924, there would be an event in August. There would always be an event at St. Nino's Day. So all, very important Georgian holidays and events were commemorated. Usually it was done in New York. because I would say the majority of the Georgians at that time were in New York. So even though my father and Givi were in Boston, they would go to New York and all the events would be held. They'd have black tie parties at the St. Regis Hotel, and they were really quite glamorous events back in those days. It was it was difficult because, you know, there was no access to Georgia, but the Georgians, being wonderful Georgian, they were able to celebrate and find ways to make an event very elegant and commemorate important holidays. So the role was quite different. Some of the things that were done, for example, would be Givi testified in front of Congress on a variety of occasions. The crimes against Khrushchev were actually published, so there's congressional testimony where Givi is talking about these issues. He often talked on the Voice of America, so he was often broadcast to Georgia on the Voice of America. So he was frequently contributing to that, maybe even, you know, once a week. So he spoke with them quite a bit. And other initiatives were undertaken to try to help, you know, connect with the Georgian people. But it was difficult. So the role of the Georgian Association was really quite different in those days. After Georgia became independent in 1991, the role of the Georgian Association became very unclear. There were multiple waves of emigres that had come over. It had become much more fragmented, much more class-oriented. There were definitely different segments, and there was no cohesiveness. There was no succession planning, so there was no generation involved. It was all a generation of people that were in their 70s at that time, and no one younger was involved in the organization. And it got to the point where there was some infighting, and Givi had to come back in and take over as interim president again. And he said to me at one point, I think we should just close it down and give what money we have to the state of New York, because I don't see any hope. Which, knowing my uncle, if anybody knows my uncle, for him to say that is really shocking, because he believed that anything was possible. And for him to, you know, give up is really unusual. I've never seen him give up. And I to this day think maybe this was a trick that he played on me, because he must have known that I would say, no, that's not acceptable. I can't see this organization, which has been around at that point for 65 years, you can't give up on this organization. And my background was very different. You know, I mean, I felt very Georgian, but at that point I had only been to Georgia twice. I came in 1989, you know, this 1 month trip with my cousin Nina and Givi. And then I came in 1994 for this wonderful World Congress that was held. And that made quite an impact on my life, I have to say, because that was the first time I saw all the diaspora from all over the world come to Georgia and be together, united, trying to really make a difference in this country. And there were a few other Georgians of my generation that were here then. One was Nicole Jordania, and the other was Paula Zazadze. And seeing those, you know, Georgians of my generation was very inspiring, and it gave me some hope that I wasn't alone, and that there were other people that were Georgian diaspora that, you know, were living outside of the country, that cared enough and wanted to be part of, you know, this newly re-independent country. So that was quite an impactful trip for me. And so when Givi was talking to me in 1995 about the Georgian Association, that's when I thought, you know, maybe I can do something with this organization, because I have wonderful business training. I went to, you know, one of the best business schools in the world. I went to Dartmouth's business school called the Tuck School of Business. And I had an excellent degree from Brown University, and I had worked in some really wonderful companies, McKinsey and Company, JP Morgan, and General Mills, among others. And so I felt as if I had the business expertise and the strategic vision for, you I saw there was potential to do something. I just didn't know at that time really what it would be. So I said, well, let me see if I can do something with this organization. Let's not give up. So I asked Beso Sikerolidze to join me as my vice president, and I developed a brand new board of directors. So I brought in a whole new generation that had never been involved in the Georgian Association. And I then built a board of advisors that had never been involved. So I asked Othar to join my board. I asked all the former ambassadors, so Ambassador Kent Brown, Ambassador Bill Courtney, then Ambassador Ken Yalowitz after he came back to the United States. They all joined my board. I asked very famous Paul Nitze, who's a well-known negotiator on disarmament, to join our board, and he joined as well. And I identified other people that were strategic, for example, Professor Richard Pipes from Harvard University. So I built a board of advisors and a brand new board of directors, and I spent a fair amount of time, probably 6 months, really understanding what the market conditions were. Who was the Georgian American community at that point? What were their needs? What were Georgia's needs? Where could the Georgian Association play a constructive role? And as a result of that market research, I pulled together a much bigger group. So I mobilized a membership that ended up being about 2,000 people at that point. So I went from maybe 10 people involved in the association to 2,000. And I also built regional director structure. So we had a regional director for Boston, for New York, for Washington, for Atlanta, for California, and for Illinois, as a way of creating hubs of Georgian communities. So, we became quite active, and the main focus that I really identified that, was an opportunity was foreign aid. Because at that point, in 1996, Georgia was only getting $30 million of foreign aid, and Armenia, for example, was getting $85 million. And so one of the other things that I did in my market research was I looked at all the diaspora communities. I looked at the Armenian Assembly. I looked at the Central and Eastern European, diasporas. I looked at the Jewish diasporas, and I looked at those organizations. How were they structured? What did they do? What was their strategy? What made them effective? And clearly, the Armenians, have extremely powerful and influential diaspora organizations that we couldn't model ourselves after because we just didn't have those resources. But I learned a lot from all these organizations, and we also joined an organization called the Central and Eastern European Coalition, which was extremely influential in NATO expansion. And so as a result of this collaboration with these organizations, we became a very powerful voice in Washington at that time. And we were able to get the ear of the State Department and of Congress, and we had numerous meetings with members of Congress and at the White House, at the National Security Council, and even with even with Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot at that time. And what we were able to do was convince the U.S. government that Georgia was a real opportunity and that they could make a real difference with good strategic foreign aid. And as a result of the work that we did and the grassroots advocacy work, we were able to triple foreign aid. So Georgia's foreign aid went up to $100 million as a result of the work that we did. Now, we coordinated and worked very closely with the Georgian embassy at that time, with other people that were interested and cared about Georgia. But I think, we've been told that it was our work, the voice of the Georgian American community, that made the biggest difference in the congressional change increasing foreign aid. One of the other really interesting projects that we worked on as part of the Georgian Association was NATO expansion, because obviously the diaspora wanted very much to see Georgia included in NATO. And through this group, the Central and Eastern European Coalition, we were very active in advocating for this first wave of NATO expansion. And as a result of my role in that, I was invited to the White House for the NATO 50th anniversary celebration. So all of the heads of the diasporas were invited, along with 44 heads of state. So in May 1999, I was 35 weeks pregnant. I went down to Washington to the White House for this gala event, and it was extraordinary because I've never been in a situation where I was sitting, you know, in the White House. Of course, it's unusual to begin with 44 heads of state. It was extraordinary. And it was a great, I think, indication of the potential that the Georgian American community has to make an impact on things like NATO expansion. And if you look at the situation now, I think there's an opportunity for the Georgian Association maybe to continue to get involved in this way. The Georgian Association currently is involved, and they're currently considered to be a good voice for what's happening. And they're invited to go to the White House and to the National Security Council and to talk about the opinion of the Georgian American community. So it's very important to engage the Georgian American community on strategic issues. What the U.S. Congress cares about is their taxpayers. So if the taxpayers want something, they will listen much more closely to the taxpayers than they will to the Georgian embassy or to, you know, the think tanks. The voice of the Georgian American community is, I don't think I even realized before I started this work how much impact you can have in this way. And I vividly remember we had a wonderful man, Besik Machavariani, who translated this 1994 uprising memoir of my grandfather's. He was based in Kentucky. And Senator McConnell, who was the most powerful senator, chairman of the Foreign Appropriations Committee at that time, and still a very powerful senator today, Besik was able to mobilize people in Kentucky to advocate for Georgia and Georgian foreign aid with Senator McConnell. And as a result of just having a few people from his district, from Kentucky, talking about the fact that they cared about this issue, made an enormous difference. Much more important than what ambassadors can do. It's surprising, but it's really the way the U.S. government works, because the U.S. government is for the people, by the people. So you were interested in some of my father's works, and my father was, I think, the most prominent engineer in his field in the world. He was really considered to be the doctor's doctor. So when there was a really unusual or difficult engineering problem, he was the person that was called in from all over the world to solve the most complicated problems. An example would be in former Yugoslavia, there was a hotel that was sliding into the Adriatic Sea. It was up on a cliff, and I can't remember now how high that cliff was, but it was starting to collapse, and nobody could figure out how to stop it. So they brought my father from Boston to come and evaluate this, and we still have this picture of this hotel standing proudly top of this cliff. And I believe people are still going there today. So that was one example. Another was he built Logan Airport. So he did the control tower and the terminal, Logan Airport in Boston. He did a very complicated air right structure, which is an extremely large mall with 2 skyscrapers and all of it on top of a highway, which is extremely complex because of all the vibrations and the weight. And so, you know, he was the specialist called in to try and figure that out. He also designed a whole city in Saudi Arabia because it had unusual soil characteristics, and they didn't know how to use the soil in this way, and also earthquake challenges as well. Which brings me to a project that he was asked to work on in Georgia. So my father never came back to Georgia. Ziagivi came, I don't know, so more times than I could possibly count. And as you know, he moved back here to Georgia in he moved back to Georgia in 2004. My father was very reluctant to come back to Georgia. It was too emotional for him, and he wanted to remember Georgia the way it was from his childhood memories. I don't think he wanted to see the difficult conditions I think he felt that if he came, he would need to stay here and try to fix everything, exactly. But he was asked by Shevardnadze to come and look at Supsa at the beginning of the early oil pipeline. And so he agreed. And he came over and he evaluated Supsa because it also had very difficult soil conditions, and they wanted to make sure that it was not overrun by this oil terminal and that it was developed in a way that is best for the Georgian nation and not just as, you know, an oil pipeline terminal. So my father, in trying to evaluate this whole situation, brought in some experts. And he created a group called the Georgian Coastal Development Foundation. And on this board, he invited General John Shalikashvili, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the former Secretary of the Army, Martin Hoffman, and a few other members to advise the Georgian government on how to best use this conditions. The Army Corps of Engineers was also involved, and they created a master plan for how Supsa could be optimized without any kind of damage to the Georgian landscape and taking full advantage of the situation. So my grandparents both influenced me, but obviously I knew my grandmother. My grandmother's name was Mariam Vachnadze Hirseli. And I was always very proud of her name and her family, and we actually have Titishwilis on both sides of my family. My grandfather's family and my grandmother's family were Titishwilis. And when I was young, my parents made a ring for me, which is the Titishwili crest. And I have worn it every day of my life since I was 13. So I'm very proud of my Georgian heritage, and I feel a real obligation to make a difference in Georgia. And I hope I can continue to do that. I feel very comfortable here in Tbilisi and in the United States. I love it when I have a chance to be in Georgia often. I feel like some years I'm not here enough. So I would certainly like to be here more than I am. Maybe someday I'd like my children to go to the American Academy in Tbilisi. They're in 6th and 7th grades now, so they'll be ready in a couple of years. And it would be a real honor to have my children at that school. In terms of my role, I would love to be able to utilize my skills, my business skills, to make a difference in any way that might be useful to this country. So I always look for opportunities and try to make myself available to the United States government, to the Georgian government, to American businesses, Georgian businesses. And I always look for opportunities to try and strengthen relationships between the two countries in any way that I can. I can't say that there has been any particular support provided. I've always worked closely with ambassadors on both sides, with Georgian ambassadors and with American ambassadors working in Georgia. So I've always felt as if I had, the ability to speak with anybody whenever I thought it would be worthwhile. I think what I remember best is when Ambassador Levan Mikaladze came to my father's funeral. And that was extremely meaningful to me. I think that was when I felt as if my family had been really recognized, because he brought a Georgian flag with him. And it was a very difficult time because my father had been very sick. And I had had to actually leave my job to try to, spend time and take care of him. And my best memory, I think, at that period, right before he died, was actually when President Bush was coming to Georgia. And it was the first time, this was May of 2005, it was the first time an American head of state had visited Georgia in history. And my father was just so happy that we had gotten to this point and that Georgia was in a position of being able to receive the American president. I think that gave him so much peace at such a difficult time. And I was so pleased because I encouraged President Bush to come and visit the American Academy in Tbilisi while he was here. And the First Lady took the time and she came to see the school and she toured the school. And I have this wonderful picture of Zia Givi with the First Lady. And when we showed this picture to my father, he could not believe it. How is it possible that my brother and the First Lady are at this school that we started? Because my whole family was very involved in the starting of this school. Givi was here all the time and very, it was his life. But my father was talking with him every day about this school. My mother was involved in this school. My mother was even involved in the selection of the headmasters. And so all of my family cared deeply about the school. And to see all of this come together was really a dream come true. As a successful businesswoman, I feel very comfortable in American business circles. And I always thought, before Georgia was independent, I always thought my career would be a traditional business career where I would be chief marketing officer for a Fortune 500 company, or maybe CEO. I felt very comfortable and confident with my business skills. And then all of a sudden, all these opportunities, came to do something with Georgia. And it was my passion and I loved it and I was willing to make that sacrifice and change my career as a result. But what troubles me about working in Georgia is that women are not given the same level of respect in business as they are in the United States. And I'm troubled when I go to a Supra and all the women are in the kitchen and all the men are sitting at the table. And I spend probably 80% of my time when I'm doing my work with Georgians, working with men. And I enjoy Georgian men very much, don't get me wrong. But I like to see more women able to make the impact I know they can have and respected at a level that they should be respected at. So if there's something I would like to see different, maybe it would be that. When I come to Georgia, I think I spend much more time thinking about my appearance than I do when I'm in the United States. In the United States, I can walk into a boardroom, I can meet with CEOs, and I think, of course, about how I present myself, but it's not disproportionate. I don't go to the hairdresser before I go to any meetings. I don't think about how I might look, how I might be perceived. I feel very comfortable, I feel very confident, I know my skills are clear, my business expertise is clear, I know my information really well. It's not about how I look, but it's what I communicate. When I come here, I need to know that my appearance is within Georgian standards so that my knowledge can be communicated. And it's a much more complex process, thinking about how women are perceived here and how to be a strong leader and a woman.